and Education and related agencies for
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 2740, which the clerk will report by title.
a bill making appropriations for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose on Thursday, June 13, 2019, a request for a recorded vote on Amendment Number 71, printed in House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Massachusetts, Ms. Presley, had been postponed. The Chair understands that Amendments 72 and 73 will not be offered. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 74, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Virginia seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 74, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Spanberger of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from Virginia, Ms. Spanberger, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Virginia.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment to H.R. 2740 increases funding towards colorectal cancer screening and prevention. Right now, colorectal cancer is the second leading cause of cancer death in the United States. This year alone, more than 50,000 people across the country are expected to die from this disease, and 1 out of 20 Americans will be diagnosed with colorectal cancer during their lifetime. When I hear these statistics, I think of more than just the numbers. I think of the families and the lives that are impacted. I think of my own mother-in-law, who was diagnosed with colorectal cancer years ago and remains cancer-free to this day. And I think of my dear friend Peg, a teacher, an advocate, and a fighter, who, when faced with her own devastating diagnosis, committed herself to educating others about this disease and the benefit of screenings. With so many Americans, like Peg and my mother-in-law, diagnosed with colorectal cancer each year, Congress needs to support prevention efforts. Over the last few years, funding for the groundbreaking colorectal cancer control program has remained the same. This year, I thank the Appropriations Committee for recognizing this problem. By bringing attention to the increasing rate of colorectal cancer among younger adults, we are sharing the gift of research and promoting the spread of a 21st century prevention. My amendment would strengthen the Appropriations Committee's efforts by providing $3 million in additional funding for colorectal cancer research under the Chronic Disease Prevention and Health Promotion Program. In Virginia, the Virginia Department of Health significantly benefits from this program and uses these funds to provide early screenings across the Commonwealth. If this critical amendment passes, the House would provide a major increase and much-needed funding for colorectal cancer screening and control under the CDC. This increased support means more necessary screenings, more evidence-based interventions, and a path towards more lives saved, especially among some of our country's most vulnerable patients. Studies indicate that as many as 60% of colorectal cancer deaths could be prevented with screening. But the number of colorectal cancer screenings has remained level since 2010. Clearly, we are overdue for progress in this fight. By making a vigorous effort to increase the numbers of screenings, we will be able to catch abnormal growths before they turn into cancer, and we can catch colorectal cancer early when treatment is more effective. As we fight for additional vital funding for the CRCCP, we are allowing prevention and education initiatives to reach more Americans, and that gives more families the opportunity to live cancer-free. We have a rare opportunity to build a coalition in this battle. Across the country, more than 1,700 organizations have committed to defeating colorectal cancer as a public health crisis, and together they've committed to the goal of 80% screened in the coming years. Congress needs to join in this effort, and my amendment can and should be part of that fight. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise to claim the time in opposition and reserve.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes. Gentleman reserves.
I would like to yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Representative DeLauro.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I rise in support of this amendment and would note that the underlying bill that we are considering today includes a $2 million increase for a total funding level of $45 million for colorectal cancer prevention activities at the CDC. Given the increasing rate of colorectal cancer among younger adults, I am pleased to further support the expansion of CDC's efforts. I am a survivor of ovarian cancer, and I thank the gentlelady for raising the issue of colorectal cancer and the importance of cancer screenings, and urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I know we will have a discussion here, Madam Speaker, about where the dollars are coming from, but I would like to, Madam Speaker, just remind the gentleman from Maryland that last evening the minority voted overwhelmingly for a 14% cut across the board, which in fact would have cut the general departmental management by 14%. So I find this line of opposition to be somewhat disingenuous. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve the balance. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Here we go again. I mean, obviously we took a 5-hour break, but now we're back to not making priorities. The bottom line is now we're up to $27 million out of this basket of money that the secretary has to manage a department that's actually increasing in size, increasing in complexity, and now we're saying that although this is a very worthy cause, there's no question in anyone's mind, I hope, that colon cancer screening, for instance, is essential, that every American who falls within the guidelines should be encouraged to undergo the screening. But we have to set priorities. If we're going to increase further the funding into that program, because as we've heard from the subcommittee chair, we've already increased the funding. If we're going to increase it further, we have to look somewhere to decrease funding that's not a magical pot of money that's endless. I mean, literally, it is true, sooner or later, the secretary is going to have to take out loans to pay salaries in his department because we will have drained the entire amount. 27 million, again, since the last vote series, which we had 1 o'clock Eastern time, it's now 9:20 Eastern time. Since then, we have drained that fund by $27 million. A lot of it transferred for good projects. But that's not the way we should be doing business here. You know, in the families in my district, if they have a priority, they set a new priority. They say this family needs this a lot right now. They look into their budget and say, what are we not going to spend on? That's what we ought to be doing. If this is so essential, Madam Chair, I would suggest that some other program, not a magical pot of money that some people believe has no bottom. But of course, again, the secretary has to run an increasingly complex department. The bottom line is that we've now drained, again, just since, if all the amendments pass that we've discussed since 1 a.m., $27 million out of the fund. This is not the way we ought to do business. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Chair, I have trouble with that argument from my colleague across the aisle when last night he voted for a 14% cut across the board to this pot of money, which he refers to as a magical pot of money. Thank you. And I think it's incredibly important that when we are looking at the priorities such as prevention, priorities such as early detection related to such a disease that kills so many Americans, where prevention and early screenings are vital to survival levels, it is incredibly important that we prioritize screenings and invest $3 million is what this amendment stipulates towards this vital effort. I thank you very much, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Look, we're showing the American people right now that we live in fantasy land. The bottom line is the amendment that I and many of my colleagues voted for last night merely restores this bill to the current state of law. It makes it comply with the Budget Control Act. Now, I didn't vote for the Budget Control Act, but it is the law of the land, and we can pretend it's not. And that's the difference between us and the people in my district. You see, they don't have monopoly money to play with. They can't pretend that the law isn't the law. They can't pretend they can invent money in their families. They have to follow the laws. They have to follow their budgets. But I guess that's just not true. This is why Congress has a 9% approval rating. Because the people watching us today, the millions of people watching us today, or maybe several 100,000 watching us today, are watching promises being made that can't be kept, promises being made that take money out of not this generation, but the next generation and the generation following it. And again, this is a worthy cause. But the bottom line is, last year, when the majority was in the minority, every single member in the Appropriations Committee voted against funding this program when it left the committee. Every single majority member when they were in the minority. I get how this game is being played. I get it. We have to restore fiscal discipline, the same fiscal discipline every family in our districts has. If you set a priority and you decide this is necessary to spend on, you find something that's not necessary to spend on. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves.
Madam Chair, I would like to note for the record that I am new to Congress, elected in November, so I was not here last year or last Congress during the tax bill cycle, but given that you were, or that my colleague across the aisle was, I find the lectures about fiscal discipline to be very challenging to take when we're discussing monopoly money, fantasy land money, and taking money from the next generation. Indeed, I know a great deal about the challenges that ride on the fact that we have increased our debt year after year, and I find it very difficult to listen to lectures about this from a colleague who, in fact, voted to balloon the deficit. This is about prevention and screening. This is about the health of Americans, and this is about being proactive in our spending. I reserve the balance of my time.
Madam Chair, parliamentary
Woman's time
inquiry.
has expired. The gentleman is
remaining?
recognized.
Madam Chair, parliamentary inquiry. Is any time remaining on the other side, because the gentlelady moved to reserve her time?
The gentleman from Maryland controls the only time.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Well, I'm not sure, I'm a physician taking care of people for 35 years. I'm not sure I should be lectured, Madam Chair, on the proper way to take care of people in this country with regards to their health. I understand the attraction, maybe bringing a tax bill into this. I'm not sure why the proponents can't leave this as a discussion of funding health. The bottom line is, this is an important subject. No question about it. I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Madam Speaker, I ask for a recorded
The
vote.
gentleman from North Carolina is recognized.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 75, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 75, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Delgado of New York.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from New York, Mr. Delgado, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New York.
Madam Chair, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
Gentleman is recognized.
Madam Chair, upstate New York and communities across the country are experiencing an unprecedented increase in Lyme disease and tick-borne diseases. At all 14 of the town halls I've held in my district this term, folks ask me, what is Congress doing about Lyme disease? Today, I'm offering an amendment to better understand and prevent this disease. The amendment adds $1 million in critical CDC funding for the prevention, diagnosis, and treatment of Lyme disease. This package of appropriations bills makes critical investments in our priorities. But as temperatures rise and families spend more time outside, we must invest more in treating and preventing Lyme. Lyme disease is a devastating disease that can often go undetected as it travels through ticks, tiny bugs that reside in dense forests in rural areas, areas found all across my district in upstate New York. While most Lyme disease patients who are diagnosed and treated early can fully recover, 10 to 20% of patients suffer from persistent symptoms, which for some are chronic and disabling. These numbers are even more startling as we consider that over the last 25 years, Lyme disease has increased by more than 300% in the northeastern states. In 2017, there were 3,502 confirmed cases of tick-borne Lyme in New York State alone. Madam Chair, I have 5-year-old twin boys, and whenever I do bath time, I have to check for ticks. And there have been a few scary moments where I've actually had to pull ticks out of my little boys. It is a frightening experience. Parents, myself included, are sending their children into their backyard or local park with fears that they could return with a chronic, lifelong, and potentially disabling disease. But this is not just a medical or moral issue. Lyme disease is costing our economy. How much money are the American people spending on this disease as we still know so little about it? Studies indicate that Lyme disease costs approximately $1.3 billion each year in direct medical costs alone in the United States. The American people are spending $1.3 billion on the symptoms of a disease rather than investing in medical research to treat and prevent it. This figure doesn't even address the opportunity cost of failing to act to address Lyme disease in our communities. How will our local economy attract tourists when people can get sick? What is the cost of keeping children cooped up inside rather than enjoying the outdoors for fear of tick-borne illnesses? Upstate New Yorkers and communities struggling with tick populations need medical solutions now to stop this disease in its tracks. Prompt diagnosis and treatment of tick-borne diseases are crucial to prevent long-term complications. Today, available diagnostic tests can be inaccurate and complex to interpret, especially during the earliest stage of infection when treatment is most effective. My amendment offers funding to better understand the disease and allow for research to develop a more effective treatment of the disease. Unlike in other infectious disease settings, tests to directly measure the presence of the infecting organism are not available for Lyme disease. This leaves physicians without the tools needed to diagnose, and without an accurate diagnosis, it is challenging for physicians to provide early treatment. The disease requires specialized treatments, which requires real investment in research to better manage and prevent the disease. Madam Speaker, time to invest is now. Indeed, the National Science Foundation has declared that Lyme disease is an emerging global pandemic due to climate change. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Madam Speaker, I'd like to reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to claim the time in opposition and reserve.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 5 minutes and reserves his time. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'd like to yield a minute to the gentlewoman from Connecticut, Chairwoman DeLauro.
Thank you.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman, and I rise in support of his amendment. I commend the gentleman's efforts to highlight Lyme disease, which unfortunately has spread to many states due to climate change. The geographic area in which ticks can survive is increasing, as milder winters result in fewer disease-carrying ticks dying during the winter. I'm proud that our bill includes a $1 million increase for a total funding level of $13 million for the CDC to intensify efforts to develop better diagnostics and to bolster critical prevention and surveillance networks. This amendment would provide an additional $1 million increase. And I thank the gentleman for offering this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes. I might also add that last evening, the fiscal year 20 House bill we spoke about provides $193 million for the Secretary of HHS's administrative budget. Yet last night, Republicans, including my colleague, voted to cut that budget by 14%, which would have cut the Secretary's budget by $27 million. So the argument that's being made is a fantasy and really somewhat disingenuous. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York's time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. What's disingenuous is trying to make an argument that somehow this, this bill falls within current statute. The Budget Control Act is the controlling statutory authority, and this bill is 14% above the Budget Control Act. Now, most people might think a move to restore the congressional action to lawfulness is actually a good thing. In fact, maybe Americans who watch, who have to live by a budget in their households, actually wonder why we can't do it here. They look at $1 trillion deficit and they say, wait a minute, I can't do that in my household. Why does Congress do it to the country? Look, the gentlelady from Connecticut, the gentleman from New York, they share something in common with Maryland. We are where Lyme disease is endemic. No question about it. It's a problem. My problem is not with CDC dealing with Lyme disease. With this amendment, we're now up to $28 million taken from the same source. This pretend bottomless fund that all we got to do is we just got to go to this. We can draw all we need out of this fund. It's not the way budgeting works. It's not the way budgeting works in any family. It's not the way budgeting should work here on Capitol Hill. And again, I remind my colleagues, people look at how Congress operates in wonder, not awe, wonder. They figure, why can't Congress run the country like I have to run my household? And it's because we don't we don't choose priorities here. We say this is important, and it is. But we fail to do what all the families in America do. When they decide something is more important, they choose something that's less important and forego spending money on that. So that's the deficit in this amendment. This amendment is a worthy cause. Lyme disease is a terrible disease, as the gentleman from New York knows. We're not even sure how to diagnose it. Chronic Lyme disease is an enigma to scientists and to medicine. It should be a priority. But coupled with that priority is finding something else that's of lower priority and deciding not to spend as much there and to spend more here. So that's why reluctantly I urge the body, if they pass the other amendments that we've chosen considered since 1 a.m. the last time we met, this would make $28 million out of that mythical bottomless fund that all these good ideas are funded from. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Madam Speaker,
For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New York will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 76, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentleman from Colorado seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 76, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Crow of Colorado.
To House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Crow, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Colorado.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I rise today to offer an amendment supporting an additional $5 million appropriation for Project SERVE. Project SERVE and programs like it provide mental health resources to students and extend critical support in the wake of tragedies, such as school shootings like the one that took place at STEM school in my district. By increasing funding, we can increase our ability to address the mental health among our precious population, our children. The underlying bill doubles the amount of funding for Project SERVE to $10 million. Moreover, additional funding was provided in the disaster supplemental that I was proud to vote for in May. I thank the chairwoman, ranking member, and the members of the committee for their hard work to ensure that this program is properly funded. With my amendment, I hope that we can continue to scale Project Serve and mental health programs like it so that we can ensure that every student gets the help that they deserve. In the time since the STEM school shooting in my district, I've had the privilege to meet with several students and their families. Their courage and thoughtfulness is unparalleled. We discussed and reflected on ways that we in this body can help students in a bipartisan manner to cope with crisis. What can we do? How do we restart the learning process? How do we prevent future tragedies? The common denominators were expanding mental health curriculums in schools, grief counseling, helping students, teachers, administrators, and their families recover. It was something that we came together and found some bipartisan consensus on in the discussions that I've had. Experts can attest, shootings and other school tragedies take a terrible toll on our students, causing sleep disorders, anxiety, and even PTS. We need programs like Project Serve. We need to ensure that our children have access to mental health services they need in order to recover, in order to focus on their studies, and in order to make sure tragedies like this never happen again. And we need to scale this program and those like it to make sure that this happens at a much larger national scale. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield to the chairwoman, Ms. DeLauro from Connecticut, as much time as she may consume.
Thank
The
you.
gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in support of this amendment and the Project School Emergency Response to Violence, Project Serve program. The program provides counseling and referral to mental health services, as well as other education-related services to school districts, colleges, and universities in which the learning environment has been disrupted by a violent or traumatic crisis. To strengthen this critical program, the underlying bill increases the set-aside within the School Safety National Activities Program by $5 million over the 2019 enacted level. I appreciate that the amendment is drawing attention to this important program, and I am happy to support it and yield back the balance of my time.
I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. Does any member seek time in opposition? The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'm prepared to close. We have an obligation to take care of our students, teachers, and school administrators after horrific tragedies. We must ensure that they can grieve, heal, return to school, and focus on learning and moving forward with their lives, all while feeling safe doing so. I look forward to working with the distinguished chairwoman, appropriators, and members of the authorizing committee to support Project Serve and programs like it in the months and years ahead. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The
Madam
amendment
Speaker.
is agreed to.
Madam Speaker, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Colorado will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 77, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 77, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Houlihan of Pennsylvania.
Thank you.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I rise today in support of my amendment, H.R. 2740, which advocates for funding for the Department of Education's Comprehensive Literacy Development Grants. The LEARN program provides competitive grants to states to help local educational agencies develop comprehensive literacy plans to ensure high-quality instruction and evidence-based intervention strategies for all students from birth through 12. This program is the only federal funding stream to support these statewide efforts. This funding allows local school districts to support high-quality professional development for teachers, teacher leaders, principals, and specialized instructional support personnel to improve literacy instruction for struggling readers and writers, including English language learners and students with disabilities. The state of literacy in our country is alarming. Before coming to Congress, I taught high school chemistry, and what I found was that most of my high school students couldn't read above a third or fourth grade level. How could my students learn chemistry if they couldn't read? How could they expect to later in life be able to pursue a quality and rewarding life? It was a wake-up call for me, and I spent the next 4 years, as a consequence, building a nonprofit that focused on early childhood literacy in our most disadvantaged communities. According to the National Institute of Literacy, approximately 32 million adults in the U.S. cannot read. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development found that half of U.S. adults cannot read a book written at an 8th grade level. The fight for a more literate America is crucial, and we must acknowledge that low literacy more dramatically affects communities of color. On the most recent National Assessment of Education Progress in 12th grade reading level assessments, 46% of white students scored at or above proficient, while only 25% of Latino and 17% of Black students scored proficient. In essence, the fight for literacy is a fight for a fairer country, for a more level playing field. How can we expect young Americans from every race, gender, and socioeconomic background to be ready for our workforce? How can we be living up to the notion that every American deserves a shot at the American dream if we are not aggressively fighting to ensure that they have the most fundamental ability to read? Our inaction is costing us all. The National Council for Adult Learning estimates that low literacy costs our country $225 billion each year in non-productivity in the workforce, crime, and loss of tax revenue due to unemployment. The American Journal of Public Health found that in excess of $230 billion a year in healthcare costs is linked to low adult literacy. Our inaction on literacy is costing us nearly $500 billion a year. I know I believe, and I'm sure that many of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle believe, that every American child deserves his or her shot at the American dream, at the ability to get a quality education and to make a living wage to support themselves and their families. We are denying millions of people their shot and their promise in this country by refusing to more aggressively advocate for and fund programs that do critical work of increasing our literacy levels. I thank the House for the consideration of my amendment, an important first step in the long overdue fight for a more literate and, by extension, a more fair America. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
I just would like to take this opportunity to thank the chairwoman of this committee. I yield the chair a minute of my time.
The gentlewoman from Connecticut is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady. I rise in support of this amendment and of comprehensive literacy development grants, which help states and school districts provide evidence-based literacy instruction for disadvantaged students from birth through grade 12. Literacy is a mark of a civilized society, and it is one of the most important predictors of a student's success. To further advance literacy skills for students across the country, the underlying bill provides $195 million for comprehensive literacy development grants, a $5 million increase over the fiscal year 2019 enacted level. I might add that the Trump administration cut this program. Literacy, they cut it. And they also cut the innovative approaches to literacy, again, which we have increased by $2 million. It may mean that they don't understand that literacy is a mark of a civilized society. I appreciate that the amendment is drawing attention to the importance of this program and am happy to support it. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Look, the Trump administration followed the law. I know that for Congress here, we don't really like to follow the law. We think we make it for everybody else. We don't have to follow it. And in fact, the bill we're discussing today doesn't follow the Budget Control Act. It pretends that the law doesn't exist. Now, the Trump administration did the appropriate thing and said, you know what, the law does exist. The reason why we get into trouble, why America looks at what Congress does, the profligate spending that we have, the trillion-dollar deficits, the $22 trillion debt, is because in some cases like this, we just don't follow the law. And the president says, no, we should return to law. If the Congress thinks we ought to spend more, then pass a bill that changes the Budget Control Act. But, Madam Chair, I would suggest that if the president had not followed the law, the complaint would be the president's not following the law. You're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. The president follows the Budget Control Act, submits a budget consistent with that, and then gets blamed by the majority for following the law, not playing make-believe budgets. Madam Chair, our families can't do make-believe budgets. They have a certain amount of money and they have to stay within that budget. But I guess we're Congress, we're different. We can make believe. This is why we have a 9% approval rating. Because Americans look at what we do here in Congress and say, this isn't the real world. This education is important. No question about it. But we have to place priorities, and I reluctantly oppose and yield back the balance of my time.
Before the gentleman yields, the chair would like to note that the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania still has a minute and a half.
Then I reserve the balance
Reserve?
of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentlewoman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Madam Chair, I am nearly speechless with the conversation that I have just heard, where we are talking about the most fundamental of things that we need, the equipment that we need to be functioning in our society, that skill of literacy, that we are thinking in somehow that this is a checkbook balance situation rather than an investment in a child, an investment in a family, an investment in the future. If we're talking about the need to imagine, we have to give people the skills so that they may imagine the life that they will be able to have when they are able to read a street sign, when they're able to read to their child, when they're able to read their driver's test. These are things that we should not deny anyone. These are fundamental things that we absolutely have to provide to every single citizen in our economy. If we are not providing education and literacy, what good is this nation? And I will conclude by saying that I came here to Congress and I stand on this floor, the daughter of a refugee from Poland. He came here with nothing as a 5-year-old. He came here with no literacy skills. And a generation later, I'm standing here in front of you because my father had the opportunity to learn to read. My father had the opportunity to pursue the American dream. And 70 years later, I stand here in front of you because that is the promise that our nation makes all of us and the investment that our nation makes in every one of us. I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak about something that I'm deeply passionate about. I'm confident that the vast majority of our nation is deeply passionate about this, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Madam Chair, may I inquire how much time remains?
The gentleman has 3 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I won't take 3 minutes. We obviously have a lot of work to do this morning, done a lot of work last night. You know, part of the American dream, and my parents as well came to this country, and it's amazing that the children of immigrants can sit on this floor, but they came to this country because there's a rule of law in this country. And the law right now says, under the Budget Control Act, that we should be spending much less than this bill suggests overall. And the Trump administration proposed spending within the law. Now, that law is not a Trump administration law. That law was actually signed by the last president with the majority controlling the Senate. It was a bipartisan agreement, the Budget Control Act. But again, we pretend just doesn't exist. This is part of the problems. Americans look at us and say, wait a minute. You expect us to live by the law? In fact, you insist that we live by the law, and now talk about imagination. This is really imaginary, because we're presenting a proposal here today that spends tens and tens of billions of dollars more than the law says we are authorized to spend. That's astounding. No wonder we have a 9% approval rating. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
I ask for a recorded
Gentleman
vote.
from North Carolina is recognized.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Madam Chair, the Committee of the Whole House.
The Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2740, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2740 and has come to no resolution thereon. House Resolution 436. Rule 18, the Chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 2740. Chair appoints the gentle lady from Texas to preside over the Committee of the Whole.
The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of the bill, H.R. 2740, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose earlier today pursuant to House Resolution 431, further proceedings on Amendment Number 77, printed in House Report 116-109, offered by the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Houlihan, had been postponed. Pursuant to House Resolution 436, further amendments printed in Part B of House Report 116-111 may be offered at any time during consideration of the bill for amendment, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and an opponent, may be withdrawn by the proponent at any time before action thereon, shall not be subject to amendment except amendment described in Section 4 of House Resolution 431, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 116-111. For what purpose does the gentleman from Wisconsin seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report Number 116-111, offered by Mr. Pocan of Wisconsin.
Pursuant to House Resolution 436, the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Pocan, is recognized, and he will control 5 minutes, and a member opposed will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I rise today to offer an amendment that ensures the Trump administration cannot block critical, groundbreaking research solely because it utilizes human fetal tissue. I believe this new policy announced by HHS just last week is short-sighted and that Congress should make its voice heard on the issue. This amendment prohibits any funds in the bill being used to establish a sham ethics advisory board with regard to research products that use human fetal tissue. The June 5th announcement bars NIH scientists from conducting any research using fetal tissue unless an additional Ethics Advisory Board review of NIH grant applications for fetal tissue research occurs. This decision by President Trump is unnecessary since these grant applications are already subject to rigorous ethical review requirements. Currently, any federal funded research that uses fetal tissue must comply with oversight pursuant to the NIH Revitalization Act of 1993, which was enacted on a bipartisan basis. This framework requires informed consent and declarations pertaining to fetal tissue from all donors, physicians, and researchers involved. Let's be clear, the Trump administration's decision is not about science or ethics, it is about politics. Fetal tissue research is not new. It has been supported by the NIH since the 1950s, and fetal tissue has been used to develop vaccines that have helped and improved the lives of billions of people around the world. Vaccines for diseases such as measles, mumps, rubella, chickenpox, whooping cough, tetanus, hepatitis A, and rabies were all created using fetal cell cultures. And researchers today are using fetal cells to develop vaccines against diseases like Ebola, HIV, and dengue fever. Studies at UW-Madison in my district involving fetal tissue are trying to develop treatments for conditions that include blindness, Zika, developmental disorders, and diabetes. This is exactly the type of research that the federal government should be supporting, not defunding. I encourage my colleagues to ensure that we all continue to fund critical research on behalf of the American people, and that we block last week's decision, which threatens federal funding of fetal tissue research. And I yield 1 minute to my amazing colleague from the state of Connecticut, Ms. DeLauro.
I thank the gentleman rising strong support of Congressman Pocan's amendment. The administration's decision to forego promising research to develop treatments, cures for diseases, HIV, ALS, Parkinson. This is once again putting extreme personal ideology ahead of public health. Researchers have used fetal tissue in research for decades to develop vaccines, cures for diseases such as polio and measles. The research has saved millions of lives. That's what we're about, saving lives. Research involving fetal tissue is conducted subject today to strict guidelines. It lasted through both Democratic and Republican administrations. This anti-science decision will stall medical research in its tracks, reduce hope for those suffering from debilitating diseases, and harm the ability of the American scientists to continue to lead global efforts on biomedical research. The Trump administration has said that the Department of Health and Human Services conducted an audit, scientific review of fetal tissue research that led to this decision. Quite frankly, they refused to make the results of that review available to the Congress. There's simply no scientific or ethical basis for the proposed restrictions on this vital research. It's misguided. It's a dangerous policy, should be reversed. I support the gentleman's amendment and yield back.
The gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman reserves.
Yeah, I reserve.
The gentleman, for what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland rise?
Madam Chair, I rise to claim time in opposition to the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Let's get a handle on exactly what this amendment does. This amendment says we're going to take one of the most controversial regarding the ethics of the research, and we're going to say the federal government can't determine whether it's ethical. Madam Chair, we have a construct for this. This construct was developed by Mr. Waxman 2 decades ago, signed in a piece of statute signed by President Clinton that said, when you submit research for funding to the HHS department, and there is an ethical, it's a topic around which there is ethical questions, or there are ethical questions, that the secretary can choose to seat a panel, not a sham panel, but a panel that consists of attorneys, ethicists, practicing physicians, theologians, and scientists with substantial accomplishments in biomedical and behavioral research. That doesn't sound too sham to me, but it's a panel that's going to review it because, Madam Chair, without that, the only review this gets with regards to, for instance, an institutional review board is at the institution that stands to gain the funding when the project is funded. It's because of that conflict of interest that the Congress thoughtfully said in statute that we ought to have a mechanism to consider the ethics. Now, Madam Chair, you're going to hear about all kinds of things done with fetal tissue. Yeah, they were done decades and decades ago. Those vaccines are done on cell lines that have been around for a long time. Can there be some research that might benefit from fetal tissue? Sure, there can be. But we should always make the determination if it's ethical. How can we stand in good conscience and say, we're going to take, again, on a basis of ethics, one of the most controversial areas of research, and wall it off and say the federal government can't consider ethics? Oh my gosh. That's a step way too far. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Wisconsin is recognized.
I will reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves.
Reserve my time.
Gentleman reserves.
How much time do I have left, Madam Chair?
Gentleman has 1.5 minutes remaining.
Great, thank you. Well, apparently the other side of the aisle would apparently like to debate political science rather than medical science today. I understand that. It's always great to make your base happy rather than healthy. But there's a big difference when it comes to the issue of fetal tissue. We've had this debate before in committee. This isn't new. But what is new are the cures that are coming out of the use of fetal tissue, not just at UW-Madison, but across the country. And the president's action, let's show how far removed, not just the debate that we just heard, that's more about politics than science, but over half of the people don't even have to be scientists who are on this new board when we already have the proper oversight in place to make sure that this is ethical research. So I get it. You've got to make your base happy, especially in the era of Donald Trump. But the bottom line is you're hurting your constituents by trying to place politics over medical science. That's just a really bad idea.
Supposed to be addressed to the chair.
Members shall direct their remarks to the chair.
Yeah, which I was doing, Madam Chair, and I appreciate that. Thank you. So again, if you want to be a scientist who doesn't believe in science, that's fine. That means you're a politician. I would like to think that those of us who are going to deal with areas that involve science, even if we are politicians, focus on the science aspects, and I'm going to do just that. That's why this amendment's important, to make sure that we have life-saving research, and I urge support, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields.
Thank
The
you, Madam
gentleman
Chair.
from Maryland is recognized.
Can I inquire as to how much time remains?
Gentleman has 2.5 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Before I came to Congress, I actually was a medical scientist. I actually held NIH grants. So, Madam Chair, I find it a little unusual that someone would criticize my opinion and dismiss it on medical science. But we live in a strange world. That's why the American people look at Congress and wonder what's going on. The fact of the matter is, it's not a Trump administration policy that issues where ethics are involved should go to a committee convened to consider that. Madam Chair, I've had things go before IRBs, institutional review boards in institutions. It's a good first step. And the peer review process at NIH is probably a good second step. But for some issues like fetal tissue research, where we saw fetal tissue marketed, brains, $800 plus tax. We think it's not at all unreasonable that the federal government, before spending a dime of taxpayer money, because remember, the president's policy does nothing about funding it. It just says taxpayer dollars shouldn't be used unless you've considered the ethics. My gosh, there's nothing wrong with that. The fact of the matter is, Americans don't want their tax dollars spent on things unethical, and this is the way that we can determine whether it's ethical. And again, this has not been set up by the Trump administration. This was Mr. Waxman, who will never be confused with a Republican, and signed by President Clinton. And I will remind the gentleman that this issue has been discussed in committee for a few years. And the committee has come down on both sides of it because this is a controversial issue. And controversial issues best left to the experts, just like this Ethics Committee statute states. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question, the gentleman is recognized. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Wisconsin will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 116-111. For what purpose does the gentleman from New Jersey seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 2, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-111, offered by Mr. Pascrell of New Jersey.
Pursuant to House Resolution 436, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey.
Well, first, Madam Chair, I want to commend Chairwoman DeLaura, the gentlelady from Connecticut, and Ranking Member Cole for their work on this bill and accommodating a bipartisan amendment. I want to thank my colleagues, Congressman David McKinley, Congresswoman Diane DeGette, Congressman Scott Tipton for working together with me on this quest for the past 2 years. The Alternatives to Opiates in the Emergency Department Program, or ALTO, was first piloted by Dr. Mark Rosenberg, doctor at St. Joseph's Emergency Department in my hometown of Patterson, 1T, New Jersey, and hospitals in Colorado as well. ALTO tests alternative pain management protocols to limit the use of opiates in the emergency departments. ALTO programs can serve as a new preventive blueprint for hospitals and healthcare providers across America, as our health providers grapple with the ways to combat the opioid epidemic, racking every community in our nation. And they have been working and achieving results to prevent unnecessary use of opiates. To build on these successful programs, we introduced H.R. 5197, the Alternatives to Opiates in the Emergency Department Act last Congress. To help tackle the opioid crisis, limit the use of opiates in emergency departments, this bill authorized a $10 million grant program to fund demonstration programs and test alternative pain management protocols. Thanks to the Energy and Commerce Committee, our bill was signed into law as part of H.R. 6, the Support for Patients and Communities Act. This bipartisan Pascrell, McKinley, DeGette, Tipton Amendment Number 2 would provide the full authorized funding for the Alternatives to Opiates program. Our amendment has the support of the American College of Emergency Physicians. I ask unanimous consent that their letter be included in the record. Let's give our ERs the resources to help save some more lives. I respectfully ask that the House support the amendment so that we may fully fund the ALTO program. Thank you, and I reserve the balance of my time, Madam Chair.
The gentleman's request will be covered by general leave, and the gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Maryland seek recognition?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Even though I don't oppose the amendment, I claim the time in opposition.
Without objection.
I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Chair, I want to yield a minute, at least, whatever she wants, to the distinguished gentle lady from Connecticut.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman from Patterson with 1T. I rise in support of this bipartisan amendment, and let me reiterate, bipartisan amendment. This amendment provides $10 million for a new program at the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration for a newly authorized demonstration program to hospitals and emergency departments to develop, implement, or study alternatives to opioids for pain management. As our nation continues to combat the opioid epidemic, this effort would provide the opportunity to study and develop best practices of pain management strategies that involve non-addictive medical products and other types of treatments provided in our emergency rooms. I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I want to thank the gentleman from New Jersey for this. This is a real problem we have. And as a physician, I will tell you, we haven't got this right yet. You know, there was a study done, and again, I've been taking care of patients, anesthesiologist, taking care of patients for, 30 years, 3 decades. And what we still find is that we have people who prescribe narcotics and opioids. And we know, by the way, Madam Chair, that if you give someone a 10-day supply of opioids for an outpatient operation, there's a 10% chance that they will be addicted 1 year afterwards. 10%. Now, yesterday, my son had an operation, outpatient operation. Got a prescription for 50 opioid pills. And I'm sitting there, and the surgeon thinking, oh my God, is there an alternative? Because, we were taught for years that if you go to the emergency room, you have a broken bone, you're going to get sent out with a narcotic prescription. And then they did a study that shows that alternating Tylenol with ibuprofen, acetaminophen with ibuprofen, is just as good as the narcotic. Oh my God, for decades, we've been giving people narcotics unaware that we were committing a certain number of them to a terrible life. And the gentleman's passionate about it, and I appreciate that. Because we had good news in Maryland yesterday that for the first time, the number of deaths from overdoses went down, but the number of overdoses continues to increase. We got better at preventing the deaths. Now we have to get better at preventing the addiction and treating the addiction. And Madam Chair, this amendment goes a long way toward that. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I want to thank my colleagues for the support. I hope and urge the passage of the amendment and yield back the balance of my time. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Gentleman yields.
Yield back.
Gentleman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from New Jersey will be postponed. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Connecticut seek recognition?
I move that the committee do now rise.
The question is on the motion that the committee rise. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the committee rises.
Madam Chairwoman.
Mr. Speaker, the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union, having had under consideration H.R. 2740, directs me to report that it has come to no resolution thereon.
The Chair of the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union reports that the committee has had under consideration H.R. 2740, has come to no resolution thereon. Pursuant to House Resolution 431 and Rule 18, the chair declares the House and the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the further consideration of H.R. 2740. Will a gentlewoman from Texas kindly resume the chair? Thank you.
Just this much? Okay. The House is in the Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for further consideration of the bill, H.R. 2740, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill making appropriations for the Departments of Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education and related agencies for the fiscal year ending September 30th, 2020, and for other purposes.
When the Committee of the Whole rose earlier today pursuant to House Resolution 436, further proceedings on Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 116-111, offered by the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pascrell, had been postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 78, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Arizona seek recognition?
Madam Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 78, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mrs. Lesko of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from Arizona, Ms. Lesko, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Arizona.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My amendment would strike the requirement that at least $750 million of global health programs shall be made available for so-called family planning, a funding stream that can support domestically based non-government organizations that support the global abortion industry. Regard for human life has never been higher. Polling statistics indicate that Americans are as likely to identify as pro-life as they are pro-choice. A Marist poll shows that 75% of Americans would limit abortion to the first 3 months of pregnancy. Further, Americans oppose taxpayer funding for abortion in the U.S. 54% to 39%. 75% of Americans oppose using tax dollars to fund abortions in foreign countries. That's 75%. Our policies reflect these views through the Hyde Amendment, which has protected federal tax dollars from funding abortions in the United States for the last 4 decades. The Helms Amendment, passed in 1973, to protect tax dollars from being spent on abortions through U.S. foreign assistance. Most recently, President Trump has committed to Congress and to the American people that he will veto any legislation that encourages the destruction of innocent human life at any stage. Our president has also courageously reinstated the Protecting Life in Global Health Assistance policy, which prohibits foreign non-government organizations from performing and promoting abortion as long as they are receiving U.S. tax dollars. However, domestic non-government organizations are still using federal tax dollars to perform and promote abortion abroad. In the state and foreign operations appropriations language, we use the word family planning and reproductive health to disguise giving grant recipients license to permeate foreign countries with abortion. Promoting abortion in poor, developing nations undermines our purposes in providing life-saving assistance, and I believe disrespects the cultures and sometimes the policies of those nations. It encourages the idea that having fewer children reduces poverty and economic instability instead of promoting real solutions to those problems, like more human rights and liberties and helping women be self-employed. Stopping domestic non-government organizations from using American tax dollars for abortions is consistent with our other policies, like the Hyde and Helms amendments and the PLGHA that limit government funding for abortions, and consistent with the views of 75% of Americans. These policies save lives. In the case of my amendment, thousands of children all over the world can be saved. To be clear, my amendment does not eliminate, nor does it reduce funding. My amendment aims to ensure that instead of investing funds in promoting and performing abortions abroad, the valuable dollars that fund our global health programs are invested in reducing maternal and infant mortality, treating birth complications, and enabling access to safe blood, nutrition, and antibiotics. These dollars should be used to provide quality obstetric care and true humanitarian assistance to those in need. My amendment ensures that our nation's policies align with the views of the vast majority of the American people. We must not allow this onslaught on children to continue being promoted in foreign nations, and especially not with our tax dollars. Children are a source of hope, prosperity, and development. They must be treated as such from the very beginning of their lives here and everywhere. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. Thank you. Anyone rise in opposition?
Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from New York, why do you rise?
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition and yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I am shocked that my colleague would propose an amendment that would strike all funding for bilateral family planning. These services prevent unintended pregnancies, maternal deaths, and abortions, reduce rates of infant and child mortality, empower women to stay in school and join the workforce, create stronger and healthier families, and improve economies. Aren't these bipartisan policy outcomes that both sides of the aisle should be supporting? Family planning does exactly what it says. It helps women plan when to have a family. But as we sit here today, more than 200 million around the world still lack access to modern contraceptives. If we want to build the self-reliance of countries, one of the most cost-effective measures is to increase access to the family planning services that women so desperately seek. I ask my colleagues to oppose this amendment and reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman has
Mr. Chair,
the only time.
I yield 1 minute to the gentlewoman from California, a member of the State Foreign Operations Subcommittee, Ms. Lee.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for your leadership and for yielding time. I rise in strong opposition to this amendment, which would strike the provision in the bill that increases funding for international family planning and reproductive health programs. Women around the world deserve access to the full range of reproductive health care, and the fiscal year 2020 State and Foreign Operations Bill will help to ensure that. USAID provides vitally needed family planning funds to overseas health centers. Evidence has shown that USAID family planning programs have had important real-world effect on the health of women and families worldwide, resulting in fewer unintended births, abortions, and miscarriages. Funding for our international family planning programs have also helped reduce maternal and infant deaths, a goal that has strong bipartisan support. Now, Madam Chair, I have been around the world into Africa and other countries and continents and have talked with families in villages, women and their spouses with maybe 5, 6, 7 children. Their first request of us, and I have visited these villages with Republicans, and their first request is to help them with family planning. They know that it is so important in terms of planning their births of the children, in terms of just the stability of the family and the empowerment of women, that family planning services be available. So thank you, and I oppose this amendment, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment.
Okay. Gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Cutting funds to bilateral family planning programs is simply bad foreign policy. It undermines U.S. international development objectives, hurts millions of women and girls. I strongly urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentlewoman yields. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. Sounds like a tie. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. Gentlemen, why does the gentleman rise? Rising, okay. The amendment is agreed to.
No.
For what purpose does the gentlelady?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Clause 6 in Rule 18. Further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from New York will be postponed. From Arizona will be postponed. That's it. Order to consider amendment number 79 printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 79, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank the chair. Let me also thank the gentlelady from New York, gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers, for their great leadership. But let me thank the gentlelady from New York again for her overall leadership as chair of the Appropriations Committee and her ranking member as well. These are the tools of female genital mutilation around the world. There are young girls and women that are facing this kind of brutal attack. My amendment, which makes a good bill even better, provides $1 million more to help combat the draconian practice of female genital mutilation, cutting, FGM, abroad. Female genital mutilation comprises all procedures that involves partial or total removal of the external female genitalia or other injury to the female genital organs for non-medical purposes. This practice is rooted in gender inequality, is often linked to other elements of gender-based violence and discrimination, such as child marriage, recognized internationally as a violation of the human rights of women and girls. Unfortunately, this means that an estimated 200 million girls and women today, alive today, have been victims already of FGMC, female genital mutilation, with girls 14 and younger representing 44 million of those who have been cut. For example, around the world, at least 5 girls are mutilated, cut. More than 3 million girls are estimated to be at risk. The impacts of this on the physical health of women and girls can include bleeding, infection, obstetric fistula, a complication during childbirth, and death. I ask my colleagues to think about their children, their girls, According to UNICEF, FGM is reported to occur in all parts of the world, but is most prevalent in parts of Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. And so I ask my colleagues to support this legislation, and I reserve my time.
Thank you, gentleladies. Anyone claim time in opposition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed. While this amendment does not have a budgetary effect, I would like to thank my colleague for raising such an important issue for millions of women around the world. For more than 200 million women, female genital mutilation can mean health problems that haunt them for the rest of their lives. The quest for gender equality will not be complete until women are no longer subjected to these practices. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman in reserves. Gentlelady from Texas.
I thank you very much. Mr. Chair, I am reminded of the story of Jalou, a 7-year-old from Sierra Leone, who with her mother fled to Houston to seek a life-saving operation to rectify complications from the practice of female genital mutilation, from which she suffered for more than a year. This story reads, the Women's Hospital of Texas, of which we're so proud of, the Women's Hospital of Texas saves an African girl's life. Dr. Susan Hardwick Smith and Dr. Eric Jones provide life-saving care to 7-year-old affected by female genital mutilation, only one of 200 million girls. This amendment will focus and provide an extra focus and extra resources to have us be reminded and to help these young women, girls across and around the world. Let us give them a life-saving hand up. I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson Lee Amendment, life-saving, so that more girls do not have to get this singular help from a singular hospital, but they can be helped at home, because this dastardly act will be stopped. Ask unanimous consent to put a statement into the record on USAID, and I yield back my time asking for the support of my amendment.
The gentlelady's request will be covered by general leave. So the questions on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Aye. I heard you. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman.
I'm sorry.
I thank the chairman.
Gentleman from Georgia.
I thank the chairman. I ask for a recorded vote.
I was surprised. All right. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. Thank you.
It is now in order to consider amendment number 80, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 80, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I thank you. This is a very important amendment in the cycle of life, protecting endangered species, which give the joy of life and understanding to the world, to the coexistence of humans and these wonderful species
that have given us so much knowledge. My amendment makes a good bill better by providing a $1 million focus to combat the transportation of the remains of endangered species, to bring down the desire to go after these endangered species. So many of us remember considering, or a few years ago, the brutal killing of Cecil the lion. At that time, I introduced and sought the support of my colleagues as original co-sponsors of my legislation titled Cecil the Lion, Endangered and Threatened Species Act of 2015. This bill sought to strengthen partner countries' capacity in countering wildlife trafficking and designating major wildlife countries for protection. The amendment now is offered in the same spirit to prohibit the taking and transportation of any endangered and threatened species as a trophy in the United States. Currently, the Endangered Species Act does not protect the majority of wildlife animals killed. At this point, we can choose to make wise decisions that will sustain the global population, or we can ignore the warning signs. Climate change is not the only threat facing our world. It is also massive extension of microscopic organisms to more complex insects and animals. More than 90% of all organisms that have ever lived on Earth are extinct. And so I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee Amendment, and I reserve my time.
The gentlewoman reserves. Is there anyone claiming time in opposition to the amendment?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman from New York.
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed. While this amendment
Without objection.
While this amendment does not have a budgetary effect, I thank my colleague for raising such an important issue. I was pleased to be able to increase the resources available in this bill by $10 million for a total of $100.6 million to combat wildlife trafficking and poaching. Wildlife trafficking generates more than $8 billion annually. I am optimistic that a comprehensive and appropriately resourced approach to address the drivers of trafficking will help us turn the corner. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentlelady from Texas is recognized.
I thank the little lady for her support of my original amendment on female genital mutilation, and I thank her for the support of this amendment. And I just offer to my colleagues a list of the vulnerable endangered species: giant panda, giant tortoise, giant white shark, greater one-horned rhino, hippopotamus, leatherneck turtle, longer loggerhead turtle, marine iguana, olive ridley turtle, polar bear, savanna elephant, snow leopard, sea turtle. All of these, among many others. The jaguar is now threatened. The white rhino threatened. I believe we can do better. And I would ask my colleagues to do better by supporting the Jackson-Lee Amendment. For example, the population of African elephants had decreased from 1.3 million to 400,000, with 22,000 poached in 2012. Working with my amendment, working with this legislation, we can have a greater focus on ensuring the protection of endangered species. With that, I ask support for the Jackson-Lee Amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from Texas yields back. The gentlewoman from New York is
I
recognized.
yield back the balance of
The
our time.
gentlewoman from New York yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlelady from Texas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose does the gentleman from Kentucky rise?
I request a recorded
Pursuant
vote.
to Clause 6, Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 81, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I rise as the designee of the gentleman from Missouri.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 81, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Gosar of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to offer Congressman Luke Meyer's amendment to ensure the United Nations climate change organizations are no longer used as an international slush fund for ineffective climate change research and projects. Unfortunately, many of the United Nations climate change organizations operate with little oversight or accountability, while being financed in part by the American taxpayer. Unelected bureaucrats and foreign leaders across the globe should not have greater control over U.S. policy than our citizens and elected officials, especially when we're paying for it. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or UNFCCC, and the Green Climate Fund, GCF, have been surrounded in controversy since their inception. The IPCC, which is broadly represented as the top authority on climate matters, was under fire when emails were publicly released from a university in England that showed that leading global scientists, that 95% they're always quoting, intentionally manipulated climate data and suppressed legitimate arguments in peer-reviewed journals. Further, while the IPCC supposedly issues assessments based upon so-called independent surveys of published research, some of the most influential conclusions summarized in this report have neither been based upon truly independent research nor properly vetted through accepted peer-reviewed processes. The United Nations Green Climate Fund, which unfortunately received $1 billion in taxpayer funding thanks to the Obama administration, has not approved a new project since 2017, causing the executive director of the fund to resign. According to the Green Climate Fund former co-chair, 30%, yes, 30% of the funds pledged are never going to materialize. Despite its stated goal of supporting developing countries to pursue renewable energy sources, the Green Climate Fund's pledges that do materialize are going to wealthy nations with little to no effect on emissions. Let me give you a couple examples. One project to install a solar plant in Kazakhstan directly benefited Chinese construction companies instead of investing in Kazakhstan companies. Directly investing in one of our economic rivals, China, is definitely not the best use of taxpayer funds. Worse yet, the fund proposed a $9.8 million investment in the wealthy Kingdom of Bahrain's oil sector. How is this pursuing renewables in developing countries? Many former and current members of the United Nations climate change organizations acknowledge they have made little to no progress and don't see the organization being successful in the future. This amendment is not about climate change, but about the proper stewardship of taxpayer dollars. Our constituents should not have to foot the bill for organizations that have no track record of success and have a proven history of funding corruption and bad science to advance a radical climate change agenda. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York
Mr.
seek to be
Chairman,
recognized?
I rise to claim time in opposition and yield myself such time as I may consume. Most of us, even my friends across the aisle, agree that climate change is a real global threat. Our military also believes this. Prohibiting United States contributions to the multilaterals that combat climate change is a short-sighted, harmful policy that does not prepare our country to face this threat. I cannot emphasize enough that climate change is exacerbating the root causes of conflict. We will see an increasing demand on our humanitarian and other resources if we don't address it now. We cannot afford to stand idly by while others address climate change, nor will we simply avoid its impact. We already feel its effects. This is precisely why we should not be alienating multilateral partners who want to join us in the fight. I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady from New York reserves. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I yield to the gentleman from Kentucky.
The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank the gentleman for yielding. As members may recall, during the climate negotiations leading up to the Paris conference, participants called for a green climate fund that would collect $100 billion a year by 2020. Although Congress has yet to appropriate a single dollar specifically allocated for the Green Climate Fund, The U.S. contributed over $800 million under the Obama administration through the Economic Support Fund. But a July 2018 report by Transparency International concluded that funding allocated from the Green Climate Fund was extremely vulnerable to fraud, embezzlement, and rigged bidding, since corruption risk of processes in infrastructure-related procurement is extremely high. So I urge members to support the amendment, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
And I reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
In times of crisis, we seek to join forces with multilateral partners to help mitigate and recover from damage. And our approach to combating climate change should be no different. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Once again, throwing money in the wind when it has no accountability is foolhardy. We've seen these over and over. It's good process builds good policy, is good politics. We want to see outcomes. And what we're not seeing from this is outcomes. So I'd ask everybody to join in. This isn't about climate change, it's about accountability. We need to see results, not just throwing money to the wind. And with that, I yield back and ask everybody to vote for this amendment.
The question is on an amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
The amendment is not
Mr.
agreed
Chairman.
to. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. It is now in order to consider amendment number 82, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 82, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Grijalva of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Grijalva, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment will direct $4 million within the International Border and Water Commission to clarify the responsibility for the maintenance of the International Outfall Interceptor, the IOI. This is in addition to and separate from the funding that currently exists for the long overdue repairs of the IOI. I think it's important to put some historical context into this amendment. The amendment seeks to clarify responsibility that the community, the city of Nogales and the county of Santa Cruz that make up the two major jurisdictions in that area most affected by the need for this amendment, that it's an infrastructure issue. It is an interceptor. In 1944, the United States and Mexico entered into an agreement in which the waste treatment was going to occur in the United States for Nogales, Sonora, in Mexico. And as time went by, since 1944, we now find that the treatment of waste coming from Mexico is 95%, 92% of the effort that the wastewater facility has to undertake in Santa Cruz County and in Nogales. I mention that because how to transport the waste from Nogales, Mexico to the United States for treatment under the treaty that Mexico and the U.S. signed is 8.5 miles of pipes that transport this waste. Over the last decades, and the people of those communities can attest to that, there's almost daily occurrences and seasonal occurrences during the rainy season of damage to this pipeline. The infrastructure is as old as the treaty. The infrastructure and pipes are in dire need of repair. It has been identified by anyone, the state, the federal government, as an urgency, a public health risk when there is discharge of waste into the into the drainage areas, into the streams, into the river. It creates an extraordinary public health risk for the people of Santa Cruz and Nogales, Arizona. In 2017, the governor of Arizona sent to Congress the disaster declaration process for the state of Arizona to secure federal assistance to remedy and prevent raw sewage exposure to these Arizona residents. And so my amendment seeks to clarify that very important issue of responsibility. This is a treaty, an international treaty sanctioned by the State Department that was established in 1944 that deals with an infrastructure that is falling apart and exposes issues of security for the area, where it's on the border, issues of public health, and issues of liability for the communities of Santa Cruz and the county of Santa Cruz and the city of Nogales, a fiscal responsibility that they cannot undertake, and a responsibility to repair that they cannot undertake. Just because it is a treaty, and it needs to be treated as a responsibility of the federal government, my amendment seeks to address that issue. And this ongoing international issue that impacts the safety and the well-being of these communities across southern Arizona has been addressed in the past. Senators and members of Congress on both sides of the aisle of the Arizona delegation have collaborated to remedy the situation. I would like at this point to thank Senator McSally for having the companion legislation in the Senate. I also want to thank the chair of the committee and her staff for their work in the bill. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this amendment. I would urge my colleagues to support it, and we can finally begin to find a solution to the public health threat to the residents of the area, to the security issues underlining the whole tunnel system and pipe system in Nogales, and establish the responsibility and accountability for transporting this waste from Mexico to be treated in the United States that was established by treaty, places it squarely on where the responsibility belongs, and that is with the federal government and the enactment of this treaty. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. Is there anyone claiming time in opposition?
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman from Kentucky?
I rise to claim time in opposition, although I'm not opposed to the amendment.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman, we have no objection to this amendment. The amendment deals with issues under the jurisdiction of the United States International Boundary and Water Commission, which is one of several such commissions funded under this act. The IBWC's mission is to provide binational solutions to issues that arise during the application of United States-Mexico treaties regarding the boundary demarcation, national ownership of waters, sanitation, water quality, and flood control in the entire region, in the border region. This amendment addresses a long-running problem involving a pipeline, the International Outfall Interceptor, it's called, that transports sewage from both sides of the border to the Nogales International Wastewater Treatment Plant. That plant is co-owned by the IBWC and the city of Nogales. Mr. Chairman, we can all understand the desire to enjoy clean, safe water, and we have no objection to this amendment. Let me, with permission of the chair, yield time to the gentleman from Arizona, such time as he may consume.
I thank the gentleman.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
I want to applaud the gentleman from Arizona, but also want to highlight that this is a further issue that we need to address. Not only is there a pipeline problem, but there is a floodplain problem that needs to have some jurisdiction and some changes and involvement. We become the victims in regards to when floods run. We see our infrastructure on this side of that international border to be destroyed. So this is a golden opportunity to highlight an opportunity that is a joint venture between the two countries, that we can actually see some camaraderie to actually facilitate change. I applaud the gentleman for bringing this up and look forward to seeing us remedy this continual problem. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I yield such time as he may consume to the chairman of the full committee, Ms. Lowy.
And I thank my
The
friend.
gentlelady is recognized.
While this amendment does not have a budgetary effect, I would like to thank my friend for raising such an important issue. The International Outfall Interceptor Pipeline is long overdue for repair. When wastewater leaks from the pipeline, it poses a severe public health risk and a threat to Southern Arizona's regional economy and drinking water. And I encourage my colleagues to support the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Does the gentlewoman yield back?
I yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky.
Yields all the time. Yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, yield back.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman from Georgia is recognized if he allows me to finish.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia will be the gentleman from Arizona will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 83, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
In Part B of House Report Number 116-109, offered by Mr. Gosar of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Gosar, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield myself as much time as I may consume. Mr. Chairman, my amendment is straightforward. It would prevent any funds in this bill from being used for the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change is responsible for some of the worst multinational agreements we have signed on to. These agreements set technically implausible and unrealistic emission goals in order to appease environmental extremists. This includes the flawed Paris Agreement, for example. Americans for Tax Reform estimates the Paris Agreement will cost the U.S. an estimated 6.5 million jobs by 2040 and reduce our GDP by over $2.5 trillion. NERA Consulting estimates those numbers are even higher, and that the Paris Agreement will cost the U.S. an estimated 31.6 million jobs by 2040 and reduce the GDP by over $3 trillion. In June of 2017, President Trump announced he will withdraw from the United States from the Paris Agreement, stating, and I quote, "The Paris Climate Accord is simply the latest example of Washington entering into an agreement that disadvantages the United States to the exclusive benefit of other countries, leaving American workers and taxpayers to absorb the cost in terms of lost jobs, lower wages, shuttered factories, and vastly diminished economic production," end of quote. The UN Convention on Climate Change has also become a mechanism for executive overreach. For example, when President Obama signed us up in the Paris Agreement, he did not consult Congress in any way. This was a direct assault on Congress's constitutional duty to approve any treaty signed onto by the United States. Fortunately, there is an alternative. Mr. Chairman, the best way to improve our environment and ensure our economic prosperity is to allow energy innovations in this country, not by sending millions of dollars to some transnational organization. We have some new innovations being implemented in our energy sector as we speak every day, from carbon sequestration coal plants in Texas to the shale revolution in the Midwest to solar facilities in my home state of Arizona. Locally driven solutions are creating thousands of jobs and benefiting our environment. It's a simple concept. The people who depend upon our energy resources to provide security for their families and communities understand those resources best. States and municipalities are best suited to deal with local issues than are the distant, out-of-touch Washington and UN bureaucrats. The facts are clear. The U.S. has had one of the largest absolute decreases in carbon emissions of any country in the world. From 2005 to 2017, the U.S. cut 862 million tons of carbon, a 14% decline. Over the same period, global emissions increased by 26%. China increased its emissions by 4 billion tons, and India increased its carbon dioxide emissions by 1.3 billion tons, a 70% increase. America's energy renaissance is the backbone of our economy. It's a story of freedom, prosperity, and opportunity. The story of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change is a much different one that is characterized by a one-size-fits-all policies that gives special preferences to some of the world's worst polluters like China and India. This isn't a partisan issue. This is about doing what is right for America and protecting freedom and opportunity for our children and grandchildren. I urge all members on both sides of the aisle to support my amendment. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Arizona reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition and yield myself such time as I may consume. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change brings together critical multilateral partners so the United States does not have to combat climate change alone. By supporting the UNFCCC, we are signaling to the world that we are committed and serious about combating this threat. The United States has been a party to the UNFCCC since 1992. As chairwoman of the House Appropriations Committee, I will never support efforts that jeopardize our treaty-based obligations, and I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from New York reserves the.
So once again, we hear the same lame excuse, Mr. Chairman, over and over again, that doing the same thing over and over, we're going to get a different result. Well, that doesn't work anymore. You know, trust is a series of promises kept. Why don't we set by example? And that's exactly what we're proposing here. The United States, by our technology, by our innovation, has shown the way in regards to combating climate change. And that's exactly the way that we ought to handle it. Not by some failed multinational bureaucracy that uses the United States as a slush fund. And with that, I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Gentlelady from New York is recognized.
The United States must remain committed to our global partners because climate change just cannot be fought alone. I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman from New York yields back. The gentleman from Arizona is recognized.
Once again, Mr. Chairman, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result is insanity. Once again, we've seen the ineptness of the United Nations in regards to this. We've seen the misuse of money to developed nations like China and India, and we allow them to continue to pollute. When we set the example, I like the idea of setting the example for everybody else to follow. We're the innovators, we're the leaders. We ought to establish that. And with that, I ask everybody to vote for this amendment, and with that, I yield back.
The gentleman from Arizona yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Arizona. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I thank the chairman, and I ask for a recorded vote.
It is now in order to pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on this amendment are postponed. Where is that sheet? Here it is. It is now in order to consider Amendment 84, printed in Part B, House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will now designate the amendment.
Amendment number 84, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Ms. Spear of California.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentlewoman from California, Mrs. Spear, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from California.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I rise with great enthusiasm this morning to support an amendment that would designate $40 million from the Assistance for Europe and Eurasia Fund to the Armenia Democracy Assistance. This amendment is co-sponsored by the other Democratic chairs of the Caucus on Armenian Issues here in Congress. You know, in the last year, Armenia has undergone a breathtaking transformation from a stagnant autocracy to a very vibrant democracy. The images of Armenia's Velvet Revolution bring a smile to my face every time I think of it. Having people dancing in the streets,
having a blockade, but a blockade of small toys by children in the town square. The amazing part of all of this is that this democracy occurred with not one drop of blood being shed. So it is very important at this point in time that we do everything in our power to support this new democracy. Since the revolution, Armenia has held fair and free democratic elections that swept Nikol Pashinyan to power. Recently, his government signed an agreement with the United States providing up to $16 million over 2 to 3 years to promote economic growth and good governance in Armenia. Although these efforts are welcome, they are not enough. Armenia has a rare and potentially fleeting window of opportunity to consolidate and build upon its democratic gains. Fundamental changes to its constitution, electoral code, and governance institutions cannot be achieved by repackaging existing and under a new leader. Armenia has earned a clear signal that the United States supports its democratic transformation, and resources will be brought to them to carry out that transformation. This amendment would provide $40 million in 1 year to supercharge Armenia's democratic progress. Armenia would continue to lead the process, but the U.S. expertise and assistance would serve as a true catalyst. So this particular fund is filled with over $700 million. And we are already giving $250 million to Ukraine, over $50 million to Moldova, and $83 million to Georgia. So a $40 million commitment to a country that has on its own delivered democracy is a small gift. And I urge that we support that, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to claim time in opposition, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman is recognized. The gentleman reserves, I'm sorry. The gentlewoman from California is recognized.
Will the gentlewoman yield?
I would be delighted to.
While this amendment does not have a budgetary effect, I would like to thank my friend for raising such an important issue. The progress made in Armenia's transition to democracy and the Velvet Revolution is a refreshing development at a time when so many other countries are headed in the opposite direction. This account funds critical programs to counter Russian aggression and influence in Europe and Eurasia, and support to key partners like Ukraine and Georgia. I'm prepared to work to provide the necessary resources to encourage continued progress in Armenia, and I'm willing to accept the amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentlelady and leader of our Appropriations Committee for her support, and I'm grateful beyond words. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman from California yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, the funding directed in this amendment is a significant increase above current levels. It could result in funds being cut from important partners in Europe facing Russian aggression. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
For what purpose does the representative from Georgia seek to
Mr.
be
Chairman,
recognized?
I ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New York seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
And Mr. Chairman, I'm pleased to yield to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Spears.
I thank
the gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentlelady from New York, my good friend. I rise to engage in a colloquy with the chairwoman of the State Foreign Ops Appropriations Subcommittee. I rise today to discuss the immense value to the American taxpayer and Congress provided by the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Since 2002, the U.S. government has spent over $126 billion, that's a B, billion dollars building the Afghan security forces, promoting good governance, and conducting development assistance. Created in the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act, the SIGAR, as we refer to it, has helped to oversee the effectiveness of these programs and guard it against waste, fraud, abuse, and mismanagement. The SIGAR has alerted Congress to programs stymied by corruption, flawed leadership, and poor design, while also providing implementing agencies with lessons learned that have improved their efforts. I believe that the SIGAR provides immense value to the American public and that their efforts should continue so long as the United States continues to allocate significant sums of money to the Afghan reconstruction. I want to ask the chairwoman to clarify that no language in this bill, in the bill's House report, should be construed as creating an end date for the SIGAR.
I thank my friend for bringing this issue to our attention. The committee takes seriously oversight of taxpayer dollars. I concur with the gentlewoman's remarks. The SIGAR continues to serve American taxpayers by reporting on instances of waste, fraud, and abuse in Afghanistan. The language included in the House report was not intended to suggest that the committee expects or is directing SIGAR to cease operations by September 30th, 2021. Rather, the requirement in the House report is for SIGAR to provide a plan on its future state considering the administration's proposing drawdown in Afghanistan. We must protect American taxpayer funds from waste, fraud, and abuse. I look forward to working with SIGAR on effectively achieving this important mission as the U.S. engagement with Afghanistan continues to evolve. Mr. Chair, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The committee will rise informally to receive a message. House will be in order to receive a message.
Madam Speaker, a message from the President.
Madam Speaker,
Secretary,
I am directed by the President of the United States to deliver to the House of Representatives a message in writing.
the committee will resume its sitting. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 85, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109. For what purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 85, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Meadows of North Carolina.
Pursuant to House Resolution 431, the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Meadows, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment withholds an additional $33 million from Pakistan, in addition to the $33 million that is currently being withheld. Seems like it should not be necessary, but indeed it is. I can tell you that Dr. Shakil Afridi has been in prison for his role in helping the United States government locate Osama bin Laden. And the message, Mr. Chairman, needs to be clear that imprisonment and the violation of human rights of this fine doctor needs to cease. Now, I can tell you, Mr. Chairman, you probably find the same thing back home in your state as I do in mine. Many of our constituents question why we're sending money to Pakistan anyways, let alone if they're going to violate the human rights of someone that has helped bring justice to a terrorist. In 2011, Dr. Afridi was almost entirely restricted, and he was prevented from meeting with his lawyers, and indeed his previous lawyer was murdered. He's been reportedly tortured. He's been described as now looking like a skeleton. Mr. Chairman, I can tell you that this body needs to stand unanimously together and send a clear message to the Pakistani government that we will not tolerate this kind of behavior and this violation of human rights. We need to stand with his wife. We need to stand for freedom. We appreciate the support of Freedom House in supporting this amendment. And I'd like to yield as much time as he may consume to the gentleman from Kentucky, someone I fondly refer to as Mr. Chairman, who's been a leader on so many of these issues, the gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Rogers.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding the time. And I rise in support of this amendment. This amendment would double the amount withheld from assistance to Pakistan until Dr. Shakil Afridi has been released from prison and cleared of all charges relating to the assistance provided to the U.S. in locating Osama bin Laden. I would note that U.S. aid to Pakistan has been substantially decreased in recent years, including the suspension of all security assistance funding for Pakistani military because of insufficient cooperation on counterterrorism. Similarly, the 020 request for economic assistance to Pakistan has been reduced from $200 million to $48 million. Remaining U.S. programs in Pakistan help combat violent extremism, support the rule of law, and counter narcotics, including along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border. Nonetheless, this amendment sends a strong signal that the United States views the charges against Dr. Afridi as baseless, and that we will continue to press for his release. I urge support of this gentleman's amendment, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
I thank the gentleman for his passion, and in the interest of time, I just want to encourage all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to stand for freedom, to make sure that what we do is actually send a clear message to those that will stomp out and try to eliminate those that are freedom-loving across the globe. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I will yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from North Carolina yields back. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition, although I am not opposed.
Without objection.
I share the gentleman's frustration that the current withholding, a restriction that has been in place since 2014, that has withheld $165 million to date, has not yet compelled the government of Pakistan to release Dr. Afridi from prison. It has been reported that after being held for 8 years by the Pakistani government, Dr. Afridi's health has begun to deteriorate. We must increase pressure on the government of Pakistan to release Dr. Afridi. I support this amendment, and I reserve the balance of my time. I yield back.
The gentlewoman from New York yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
The amendment is not agreed to. For what reasons does the representative from Georgia seek recognition?
I thank the chair. Ask for a recorded vote.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from North Carolina will be postponed. Okay. Okay. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, proceedings will now resume on those amendments printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, on which further proceedings were postponed, in the following order. Amendment number 48 by Mr. Jeffries of New York. Amendment number 49 by Mr. Maloney of New York. Amendment number 50 by Ms. Adams of North Carolina. Amendment number 51 by Ms. Adams of North Carolina. Amendment number 52 by Mr. Byer of Virginia. Amendment number 53 by Mr. Byer of Virginia. Amendment number 54 by Ms. Blunt Rochester of Delaware. Amendment number 56 by Ms. Murphy of Florida. Amendment number 57 by Ms. Ocasio-Cortez of New York. Amendment number 58 by Mrs. Ocasio-Cortez of New York. Amendment number 59 by Mr. McAdams of Utah. Amendment number 60 by Ms. Schreier of Washington. Amendment number 61 by Ms. Lee of Nevada. Amendment number 62 by Ms. Craig of Minnesota. Amendment number 63 by Ms. Craig of Minnesota. Amendment number 64 by Ms. Craig of Minnesota. Amendment number 65 by Mrs. Porter of California. Amendment number 66 by Ms. Porter of California. Amendment number 67 by Ms. Porter of California. Amendment number 68 by Mrs. Mercaso Powell of Florida. Amendment number 70 by Mr. Levin of Michigan. Amendment number 71 by Ms. Presley of Massachusetts. Amendment number 74 by Mrs. Spanberger of Virginia. Amendment number 75 by Mr. Delgado of New York. Amendment number 76 by Mr. Crow of Colorado. Amendment number 77 by Ms. Houlihan of Pennsylvania. The chair will reduce to 2 minutes the time for any electronic vote after the first vote in this series. The unfinished business is a request for a recorded vote on amendment number 48, printed in Part B of House Report 116-109, offered by the gentleman from New York, Mr. Jeffries, on which further proceedings were postponed and on which the yeas prevailed by voice vote. The clerk will now redesignate the amendment.
Amendment number 48, printed in Part B of House Report number 116-109, offered by Mr. Jeffries of New York.
A recorded vote has been requested. Those in support of the request for a recorded vote will rise and be counted. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This will be a 15-minute vote.
The House this week is beginning work on fiscal year 2020 spending. There are 12 annual appropriations bills that fund the federal government and related agencies. They're working on